Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta, and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. I wanted to put forth another little tidbit, taking a closer look at specifically Revelation chapter 12. And I wanted to do so because it really is wackadoodle, right? I've been trying to teach people and show people just how wackadoodle the book of Revelation is. And it's just proof that we should not be taking this book so damn literally like people try to do and try to find a point for every little thing that's mentioned in this book. It is insanely symbolic, more so than I ever even realized until I've been now looking at it through a slightly different lens and seeing just how symbolic it really is. I mean, it really defies all reality. Like I say all the time, it's magic mushrooms on steroids. It doesn't really line up perfectly with anything. It seems to me that it sort of takes like a jumbled look at the history and just kind of jumbles it together and describes it in different odd ways that really don't make sense. And so I wanted to just look at Revelation chapter 12 here and just kind of give you a little bit of commentary and just kind of again, bring to light how symbolic this crap really is. So here we go. It says in verse 1, "Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days." Okay, so we'll stop there for a minute. So first off, we see this great sign in heaven, right? And it's a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Now that's interesting because I don't know about you, but I cannot picture a woman literally clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. I mean, that's, again, magic mushroom stuff. So if you're looking to place that on a literal character or say that it literally describes something very literally, you're going to have a hard time because it's not meant for that. We notice the symbolism of the 12 stars because, of course, everything else in the book of Revelation talks about the 12 tribes of Israel. So we know that that's sort of a pull there. And then it says in verse 2, "Then being with child, this woman cried out in labor and in pain to give birth." So it's kind of interesting that this woman is giving birth, right? I don't understand exactly what that means. I'm not going to say that I'm definitive on anything. I know that there's places in the New Testament that talk about Jerusalem being the mother of them all, or the New Jerusalem being the mother of them all, and then the Old Jerusalem being a mother of them. Is that something that's going on there? I'm not really sure. But in verse 3, we see another sign appears in heaven, and behold, it's a great fiery red dragon, okay? And this fiery red dragon had 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on its heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days, or what would be a period of 42 months, 3.5 years. We see that term, 42 months, 12,360, or 1,260 days, or 3.5 years. We see that used a lot in Revelation. So again, it's probably just a symbolic time description. Doesn't really mean literal. But notice that the fiery red dragon has 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head, and his tail draws stars from heaven and throws them to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. So interesting, like some things you have to consider, because it's talking about this woman having a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. Obviously, in this particular instance, we have to understand this, or we should understand this, as being the woman who gave birth to Jesus, right? I mean, how could it not be? What other woman would bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron? Now, all nations, in my opinion, there is not a proper translation, right? Just look at Matthew chapter 2 for a second. We're going to go back here, but look at what it says here when it's speaking of Jesus. It says, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd," or rule, "my people Israel." So the prophecy in the beginning of the story when Jesus is born is that Jesus would be a ruler who would rule over the people Israel, right? And so when we come to Revelation chapter 12 and we see that she bore a male child who was to rule all nations, that doesn't really match what we find in Matthew, right? It seems like, and what I think and what I know is that this word nations is ethnos. And ethnos can be used a number of ways. It can be used for the people, which we know when the people is used in Scripture, many times it's speaking of the people of Israel. That would match Matthew chapter 2 very nicely. It could also be tribes. It's also used for tribes. So it could be she bore a male child who was to rule the tribes or all tribes with a rod of iron. Because, of course, we have to make it work with what we find in Matthew chapter 2. Jesus was born here in Matthew chapter 2 at the very account of his birth to be a ruler who would shepherd or rule the people of Israel. Okay, so very interesting. Just something to take notice of. But notice that the dragon stands before the woman who is ready to give birth, and he's trying to devour the child. Well, let's go to Matthew chapter 2 and see if this sounds like anything. The account of the wise men coming from the east in Matthew chapter 2 really kind of sounds like a little bit of that symbolism in Revelation 12. It says this in verse 1, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came and said, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him.' When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, 'In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.'" So right there we see that Herod is being told that the prophets predicted that Christ, the Messiah, would be born in Bethlehem of Judea, and he would be a ruler who would rule and shepherd the people of Israel. Okay? Then he goes on in verse 7, he says, "Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring word back to me that I may come and worship him also.' When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with his mother Mary, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to King Herod, they departed for their own country another way. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, 'Arise, take that child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word. For King Herod will seek the young child to destroy him.' When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night, and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of King Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.' Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men." Okay, so interesting here, right? In the very end of that, it says, "Now when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph, saying, 'Arise, take the child and his mother, and go back to Israel, for the young child's life. Those who sought the young child's life are dead.' And he arose and took the child into the land of Israel." Okay, and then when they heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea instead of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned by God in a dream, he turned aside into the region of Galilee, and he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, "He shall be called a Nazarene." So Jesus is kind of like fulfilling these little prophetic things as he's being born here, going from town to town. But did you notice the symmetry, or I should say partial symmetry at least, to what we find in Revelation 12 with this wackadoodle scene here in the beginning, right? We have this fiery red dragon, which could it be that fiery red dragon was Herod, King Herod? Because we know that, who was Herod? Herod was also known as Herod the Great. He was a Roman client king of Judea. And he's known for building buildings throughout Judea and different renovations made to the temple. He's in the Gospels, obviously. We know he ruled, or he was born around 72 BC, and he died around 4 BC. What else do we know about this guy? He was a vessel of the Roman Empire, says Wikipedia, and he was actually expected to support the interests of the Romans. And that was part of his rule. He really was supportive of the Romans, right? And so if we look back at Revelation at this great dragon who has 7 heads and 10 horns, it's interesting because there's a lot of connections, if you've been around the full preterist game for a while, to the horn arguments, the 7 heads, the 10 horns being, Roman kings and Roman rulers and whatnot. So there's got to be something there. And it does seem to maybe work in a wild and wacky symbolic way that the fiery red dragon was actually King Herod, right? The king of Israel. So let's see, let's go back here. Revelation 12, okay? So his tail, this fiery red dragon, now clearly this is all symbolism. If in fact this is talking about King Herod, which it could be, because we're going to show more about that in a minute here, but if it is talking about King Herod, you can see just what kind of wacky symbolism this book uses to describe that picture in Matthew chapter 2, right? If it is a link, if it is a tie, if it is a connection, then it should give you guys somewhat of an idea as to why I always urge you never to take Revelation too strict, wooden, literal. Never take it at face value because it's insanely symbolic. But look at this. The great fiery dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Like, what does that even mean, right? I know there's stars in the wise men of Matthew 2. Does that have some kind of tie-in? And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. Now, that kind of sounds like what Herod was doing. He was trying to find the child so that he could, as Matthew chapter 2 says, destroy that child. And then he actually went around killing all the babies or the newborns in Bethlehem, it says, and all surrounding districts. So it could be that this dragon is standing before the woman who was about to give birth, or who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. And Revelation 12 is speaking of that in a very general, symbolic, not to be examined with a fine-tooth comb type of way. And in verse 5 it says, she bore a male child who is to rule all nations, or I would say all tribes, or to rule the people with a rod of iron. Because again, Matthew chapter 2, the prophecy, the prediction, what this is all about, was about out of you, Bethlehem, coming a ruler who will rule my people, Israel. Okay, so I'd rather keep it in that context than make up my own context. And it goes on, it says, and her child, this is interesting, check this out. And her child was caught up to God and his throne. Now that's interesting. Here we have the symbolic wackadoodle nature of Revelation 12 saying now that the child was caught up to God and to his throne, right? So do we have any references in the Gospels where Jesus as a child was actually raptured or caught up or brought up to God and his throne? No, we don't. So again, this is just another example of Revelation going out on its own wackadoodle, isolated limb and inventing its own details that are nowhere else in the story. Her child was caught up to God and his throne. Now, that could mean that Jesus, when he ascended, that could be sort of like a flash forward to his ascension, perhaps, but he's certainly not a child. Maybe this author is speaking of Jesus as a man ascending to heaven at the ascension, caught up to God and his throne. That seems to be possible. That could be what it's talking about. But again, if that's the case, then we just went from the male child being born and Herod trying to kill that child to 30 years later and Jesus ascending up to heaven in the very next sentence. So you see what I'm talking about. There's no order to this stuff. So we have the child being caught up to God and his throne. Now, that's interesting because if that's saying that he was caught up to a throne, that would technically mean that when he ascended to heaven, he took his seat at the throne and he began his reign. That could be a tie-in. But then look at verse 6. It sort of goes back. It says, "Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God so that they should feed her for 3.5 years." So what is that, right? What is that? Well, I think that probably is related to what they did in Egypt, right? They fled to Egypt. It says, "Stay there with the child and his mother in Egypt until I bring word to you that Herod is dead and that his life is no longer in danger." So could this be the Revelation 12 symbolism of them fleeing into the wilderness where God had prepared a place for them and they would be fed for 3.5 years? It could be, right? I mean, in some wackadoodle way. I can't see what else it would be in the story, right? But let's skim down, right? If you look at verse 7, it's craziness. It says, "And war broke out in heaven, and Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, 'Now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren who accused them before God day and night has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the land and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that his time is short.'" Now, folks, if you're taking this literally, as in this is literally going to happen or has happened or was a past event, then you are a banana sandwich, okay? Because everything that we've learned from Revelation in our studies has shown that none of this makes any sense. None of it is meant to be taken chronologically. None of it is meant to say, that's precisely this event. We can come to ideas and drum up some conclusions about what they may be talking about, but we don't really have a clue. Because as I just showed you, you could be in one sentence talking about something, and then boom, the very next sentence, you're 30 years in the future. So it's really not something that you want to hang your hat on. There's a lot of passages in the New Testament that you can hang your hat on better. Revelation and all the symbolism found within, those are not passages to hang your hat on. Okay, and we see the loud voice in heaven saying, "Salvation and strength and the kingdom has come, for the accuser of our brethren is cast down, and the blood of the Lamb and the word of the testimony, and they overcame, and they did not love their lives to the dead." And then there's, rejoicing and, celebrating in the heavens. Again, just Revelation doing what it does, going to a totally different vision and showing this, this victorious vision of the kingdom has come and Christ has come and the accuser has been cast down and they overcame by the blood of the Lamb. And that's really all it is. That's really all it is. And then in verse 13, it says, "Now when the dragon saw," so now we're back to the dragon and the woman, right? We were just talking about the kingdom and celebrating that the dragon has been cast down and beaten and everything. But now we're back on the dragon chasing the woman again, right? So in verse 13, it says, "Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly to the wilderness, to the place where she is nourished for a time and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus." So again, what is going on here? We have another flash of this dragon who's been cast to the earth. He's persecuting the woman who gave birth to the child. The woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle. Now, do you think that's literal? That she might fly into the wilderness to a place prepared for her for time and half a times, which is probably the 3.5 years, another way of saying that, from the presence of the serpent. Notice that the serpent, whoever the enemy is, notice that he's being called a serpent. It's interesting because in the Old Testament, we have many instances of enemies and kings of foreign countries that they were at war with, or their adversaries being called serpents, or what is it? The Lucifer, right? I think the Babylonian king was called Lucifer. But there's other, you know who I'm talking about if you've been around for a while. I think the king of Egypt was called a river monster or something like that, or a sea monster, or people who know the Bible know what I'm talking about. So this type of reference to a ruler, a wicked ruler being a serpent is not really new if you know what's in the Old Testament. It was done before. So I think that this could be, again, speaking of Herod, the dragon, and then the woman is given the wings of an eagle. That's them fleeing to Egypt to be safe so that the child wouldn't be harmed. The serpent spewed out water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, but the earth helped the woman and opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood. I mean, this is nonsense. This is craziness. If you're looking at this saying, oh, this is the way it goes because this says this in Revelation, then you need help. You need a brain examination, because nobody in their right mind would look at the book of Revelation and the details within and formulate any kind of concrete theories on it. They just won't. If the Bible was only the book of Revelation, I would throw it out and never look at it, because it's literally that symbolic. It just, there's no order to it whatsoever. Okay? And then notice the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. That kind of matches Herod going after all the other, babies who were born in Bethlehem and all the districts. I mean, it kind of does, but then we have to deal with to make war with the rest of her offspring. Well, who was the mother then, if that's the case? Was it Jerusalem? Was it Judea? I don't know. But that's what I mean. There is no clear-cut answer to these things, and you won't find any answers to them elsewhere if you look in the Bible, because these are extremely symbolic visions and little accounts, and they're just not meant to be taken the way that people want to take them. So, folks, anyways, I'm going to leave it at that. Talked enough. Just wanted to rant a little bit about Revelation chapter 12, and again, show you how crazy Revelation is and why we shouldn't be taking some of the things that it says literal, or even trying to make great sense of them, because it's just not that type of book. It wants you to understand symbolism as best as you can. It wants to, describe things in incredibly vivid and imaginary types of ways. It uses tons of, imagery and symbolism that the Old Testament uses, Israel's Old Testament texts. And in fact, I forget the percentage, but something like 75% of the book of Revelation is actually or 50% or something crazy, is actually passages taken from the Old Testament, something like almost 400 different phrases taken from the texts of the Israelites, the Old Testament text, and put into this book, Revelation. So there's probably a lot there that we don't understand. There's probably a lot of nuances that we may not understand, but somebody way back then may have. So we're dealing with that aspect of it too. But no doubt this is a wackadoodle type of book, and I hope that you guys enjoyed this teaching. Give it a like-a-rooski. If not, take a hike-a-rooski. I appreciate your support, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.